If it's not one thing, it's got to be another. In this day and age of expensive groceries, from the endless taxation of gasoline, and we also have a situation where, according to the UN Secretary General and Al Gore, of course, we're entering into the age of global boiling. Imagine that. And things will end in 2030, likely. So who knows? But in this time, it seems like everything is pretty absurd.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
So today we're going to be talking about absurdity with our guest, Elizabeth Nickson. And welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi.
Elizabeth, I'm really honored to have you join us. You have done an awful lot of very interesting investigative journalism. You've written for many of the leading publications in the world, whether you were a journalist for Time magazine or the European bureau chief for Life magazine, as I recall. You've also written for The Guardian, the National Post, the Globe and Mail, Harper's, to just name a few. You've also written many books, and you're also a fellow at the Frontier Center. So we're delighted to have you.
Well, I'm delighted to be a fellow at the Frontier Center.
Well, I'm excited about our discussion today because we'll be covering an awful lot of topics, and I think a lot of them relate to the wide range of themes that you cover within your Substack, which is really quite fascinating. And you called it Absurdistan, if I get that pronunciation correctly. But why did you call it Absurdistan?
Well, apparently, David, it has a root in the eastern states, East Berlin and Hungary during the Soviet takeover. It was just when they imposed those sets of authoritarian rules, everything became absurd, and they actually called it Absurdistan, but they used a P instead of the D.
Oh, I see.
Somebody sent me the crest that they use. So I very much think that Canada is going hard Marxist, and much of what's happening is absurd. But most particularly when I traveled to research eco-fascists in the States, but also here, I found that regulations were written in such a way so that nobody could get through. If you wanted to build a ski hill, or if you wanted to um, uh, build a mine, uh, you had so many strange layers of regulation that sometimes, if you got through one process, which would take you a year or two and cost you maybe $500,000, there was another layer which, if you had made one tiny error in that process, and there are lots of opportunities for error, you would immediately run into a wall and your project would be finished. And it was written so tightly. All of this was written so tightly and clearly coordinated in order to stop growth, to stop economic growth. Now that made me very angry. It made me very, very angry, because it meant that ordinary people who were not connected could not get a foot on the ladder. They were, relegated to serf status no matter what. There was no creativity or energy or brilliance that could get them through the maze of regulation, um, in any way. And so I would visit farmer after rancher after forester, and the same thing came up over and over and over again. And then I started with the engineers that were in the Forest Service and all the other, you know, earth, air, land, and water agencies. And they said, look, in 1970, we were told de-development. And I would just not believe them. But it
Mhm.
was said so many times to me that if you joined the U.S. Forest Service in the 70s, you were told we are no longer expanding, we are stalling or contracting, and that's your job.
So I find that fascinating. So how do you then develop a healthy skepticism of issues that are happening? And we know that, and bear with me, but in my own experience, issues are sometimes black and white, but often there's a complexity to them. I refer to it as peeling the onion. There's different layers of complexity. I guess what I'm getting at is that who is serving whom here is a kind
Yeah.
of a primary question we all need to ask is when we see an issue, what is really going on? Are the people in power serving the people or are the people being used? Is that kind
Yeah.
of a primary principle that you struggle with in your work?
Yes. Well, I've come to the conclusion that our government in Canada, the Liberals and the NDP, are very much not serving the people. And they
Mm,
are serving some higher purpose that we don't know about. And I'm
mm.
not, when I say higher, I don't mean better. I mean that I think there's a collaboration between international socialism and the World Economic Forum.
Oh, so what do you think is really going on here then when it comes to the UN talking about a plan of 2030 to get rid of carbon dioxide? It almost sounds Orwellian, 1984, where you're taking words or facts and flipping them on their head. Is that what's
Yeah.
going on here? For to what end?
Yeah. I think it's really to stop population growth and to start drawing down the population. I
Hmm.
don't know why they want to do that because it seems absurd. But there is so much evidence that all of the people who run these programs profoundly believe that the earth is overpopulated, and they
Oh.
believe it
Hmm.
as they believe it as an existential fact, or they're using that belief in others to manipulate the situation. And
Okay.
I can't really fathom the depth of their corruption.
So that's a very different point of view that you don't really hear often. Is
Yeah,
this notion that somehow humans are the problem? It's almost like an anti-human perspective, and I guess that's a
yeah,
symptom then of very deep value differences. And I'll
yes,
get to that in a second. The sense that a lot of us have been taught that every human being is precious and made in the image of the divine. But if you don't believe that, then I guess human beings are like
yeah,
animals. They're to be
yeah,
used as instruments or tools. Is that it?
yeah.
Not that I treat animals poorly, no, but they're just to be part of a power game. Is that kind of where this gets down to the nub of the issue?
I think so. Yeah, I do.
Wow.
Um, yeah, I one of the things that has always intrigued me about modern literature is that when I was growing up in Canada, everybody went to church. It may not have been that everybody loved going to church, and certainly
Mhm.
my generation and the generation that followed wasn't, all that keen, but you kind of had to go. And that was the case in Canada from its founding as a by Europeans or mostly the English or the Brits, that everybody went to church. In my family, which is, seventh or eighth generation Canadian and 20th generation American, it was a Christian family, and every other
Mm.
family was Christian. And we would sit there every Sunday for 400 years and listen to the fact that humans are sacred and equal under God.
Right.
And once we split off from that in the 60s, humans became a virus very, very quickly. I
Mm.
mean, in terms of the sort of primitive management of humans, the fact that you had to go to church every Sunday and listen to that, even if you were an evil capitalist, you knew that you had to do something. You had to pick people up.
Mm.
And my family was particularly charitable, I think, because they'd been here for a very long time and they were prosperous. But they saw that as more important than success. I mean, success was very important, it was obviously necessary.
Mhm.
But the next step, you were not an adult unless you were working in the community directly facing other people's distress.
Hmm.
And once we lost that, disconnected. We assigned all that to government. We lost part of our humanity.
That's again a perspective we perhaps have taken for granted, and now we don't really hear about it. But I look at the world through the lens of kind of classical liberalism, and we'd say, well, a very important part of a high functioning society is to have a very important set of shared values, and one of which was, yes, a belief that every individual is precious and that they're equal under the law, including the king, queen, or prime minister. But these shared values were very important in terms of how we lived in peace as a society and how we
Yeah,
got along together well. And yeah,
yeah,
so this is all interrelated, isn't it, Elizabeth?
yeah, yeah. There was a very bad split in the late '60s um, that really turned us to the dark side,
Now,
I
what
think.
do you mean by that? In the sense of culture or values, or
Well,
what are
I
you
mean,
referring to?
I don't know whether you watch television or premium television, but I stopped a while ago, but it's all very, very dark now. There's
Mm.
nothing positive, and every single person is so flawed and so mean um, and dark, and where they are afflicted with addictions. And so all the models in our culture now are dark
Mm.
and demonic, and our heroes are billionaires with excessive. I mean, it's really a corrupted culture
Mhm.
from my perspective.
Yeah, so
um
you're really challenging us to say, wow, the culture that we drink in is very reflective of what's going on within our minds and indeed our souls,
yeah,
and we need to pay attention to that. So
yeah.
I think that's all the more reason why we need to look at our own family life and say, wow, what are we consuming in terms of media and culture? And that's why I think the emergence of new media networks is so important, isn't it?
It's critical. I mean, I think it I think new media is growing so fast
Hmm.
that, we can hardly keep up, and old media is dying. Nobody's watching these premium channels anymore. They're losing subscribers. Disney is going to have to sell Disney World. It's so Netflix has lost millions of subscribers this year alone. The CBC, which we pay 1.4 billion a year into, its news only reaches 1.34% of the Canadian
Oh, really?
populace.
I didn't realize
One
it was quite that low now.
it
Wow.
is. It's 1.34%, and most of that is radio.
Mm.
They all that world is dying,
Mhm.
and not fast enough, David.
Yeah.
Not fast enough.
So in that case, like if you look at the CBC or a lot of these issues, is it fair to say a lot of it is when you have state actors, e.g., politicians, politicize things around them? So instead of acting honorably to safeguard the function and role of those institutions, They use them cynically as a tool, as a weapon to go after their political opponent. So I don't mean this in a I mean this truly in a nonpartisan way. They politicize everything around them and they use it as leverage to move and advance power. Is that again the common theme here? Without trying to
Yes.
sound like I'm not paying attention.
Yes. Well, I mean, they're using mind control. I mean, mind control has developed to the point where they now can use it on mass people.
Now,
And
what do you mean
and
by
they
mind control, though, Elizabeth? Like, surely,
well, I
you
mean,
know,
they'll analyze what a population needs. Like, for instance, the environmental left. They'll say, well, they need this, they need to hear this, and then they will take the suburban middle class, and they need to hear that, and
mhm,
then they identify the evil doers who
mhm.
are, for the Liberal Party anyway, the right, the extreme far right, which I suppose I am. I mean, I don't know. And then they say they and then they set all three at each other. So they
Okay.
try to divide the culture and set people at each other so they're too busy fighting or arguing, and they've caused, look at our families. I mean, we can't agree about anything anymore.
Mm.
You have to actually go into a family situation and not talk about anything important if you want to get out
Okay.
without having started fights or
Right.
arguments. That is deliberate. That was created. That was deliberately created by our governments.
Okay. So there's an old saying, a house divided cannot stand. So
Yes.
are you inferring that they're kind of using a lot of people in power use the old playbook? You want to divide people, you want to create some measure of conflict so that they don't work in unity to
Yes.
build this country, but rather than you can exercise your power as you see fit. Is
Yes.
that kind of another way of saying it?
That's exactly what they're doing, and I think that the current Liberal government, because they are so close to the World Economic Forum, are using the World Economic Forum's behaviorists
Hmm.
to craft messages for Canadians. We're almost a test case because we're way out on
Hmm.
the leading edge of what Agenda 2030 wants from people from the West, uh, by which I mean the democratic West, Western Europe, and the US and Canada,
Hmm.
and Australia and New Zealand. They want us to shut our economies down so that we have a typical 1.5% growth, and our middle class deteriorates,
Hmm.
because a healthy middle class can fight back,
Wow.
and that's what they want, and they're very clear about it, David. It's in all their founding documents. It's right there in black and white, and every no matter which institute you look into, whether it's Tavistock or the Stanford Research Institute, or any of the Rand Institute, all of military intelligence, they all have these founding documents that this is the way the culture must go.
Hmm.
It it's they couch it in language that says this is going to be good, and but their fundament is that we don't have enough resources, so we must control and draw down activity,
Mhm.
and of course the whole climate change fiction thing. But that's what's going on.
I guess, if I think of the kind of the extreme measures that are being talked about when it comes to the environment today, I think, to me, it's a very interesting case study. It's an example where you ask, why is this happening? Where you have a so-called just transition being implemented, where they're trying to close Canadian oil and gas. This will have huge implications on people's
Terrible.
lives. And
Terrible.
what's driving this? I know that one of the things that you've talked about in the past, I think it's in a number of the papers actually you've done with Frontier over the years, has been the so-called iron triangle, the
Yes.
relationship between scientists, the media, and then politicians. And there's a kind of almost a perverse circular relationship that creates kind of an industry that funds
Yeah.
all this. Is that?
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that?
No, the iron triangle, the environmental iron triangle is uh, bureaucrats, environmental NGOs, and politicians, and they just work together over and over. And they often, it's less common for uh, environmental activists to become politicians, but they do. It's more common for them to move from bureaucracy to NGO back and
Mm,
forth, and that's really bad, because what happens is that these projects get funded and nobody really knows about them. No one knows what's going on. I
mhm,
mean, if for instance Peter Hawley was telling me that RFK Jr. set aside an entire section of Western Manitoba at one point and just set it aside so nobody can use it. I mean, there's so much of our country that
mhm,
is very, very beautiful that is not being used
mhm,
because the Westons have set it. Weston Foundation, along with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, has set aside so much gorgeous land that could be used for people to live in, that could be used for recreation, that could be used for wonderful hotels or
mhm.
ski resorts or just for people to visit, but now they're empty.
So, if we turn to the citizen, what do you think, Elizabeth, the citizen can do as they look at trying to be empowered to be able to, well, participate in the democratic process so that we can actually, dare I say, turn our country, in your opinion, from a place of absurdistan to a country of prosperity and democratic freedoms?
Well, I think people are fighting back, don't you? I have a sense that this is an information war, and that people are obsessively acquiring information because of the growth of new media. And the failure of old media, and people are some on an edge of panic. I sense that a lot of
Mhm,
people are because a lot of if you try to destroy the middle class, then every family's going to hurt, and when you're hurt you start to look for reasons, and
mhm,
I think that's why new media is growing so fast, and as a result, um, people have to actually get up and go to meetings.
mhm,
They have to go to their local meetings and they have to start to get involved. That's the only way to do it. In my region, which is very, very left wing and very, very green, um, we have a nascent movement of the 10,000 people on our island. Maybe 1,000 of us are fully awake as to what is going on.
mhm,
I would say about 3,000 are completely disengaged, and the rest of them are brainwashed. And I would think that that was probably a pretty good reading of the situation in Canada. I mean, that the recent polls show that everything that Polyev says is very popular,
mhm,
and everything that Trudeau says is very unpopular. So people, as long as people are becoming aware and awake, the next step is that they have to get involved and they have to shake the tree and get these people out of there. Because one of the things uh, that the government has managed to do is to empower a lot of very left wing people in local bureaucracies,
mhm,
and that has been a terrible, terrible mistake, because either they're incompetent or they are just punitive. But in fact, for instance, here, I love using this place as an example because it's so egregious. We have almost no uh, low cost housing. And there are a lot of people living in tents and in their cars and in trailers all over the place. And we are 90% of our land is under conservation. So that's 90% of free land. So there have been affordable housing um, projects on the board for 25 years that are still not approved,
Wow.
despite the glaring need. And that is because our bureaucracy and the advisory committees around it, which is what every local government has, are staffed by people on the left who, for some reason, don't want to house anyone.
Hmm.
Why? I don't understand. It
Yeah.
doesn't make sense, but they don't. And they fight it, and they fight it to the death, and they will do anything to stop the housing. So unless people get involved on that kind of level, not much is going to change.
Wow.
I mean, even if we elect a new government and they're populist, these people are still going to be in place, and they're
Mhm.
still going to be moving like, like just like ice. They don't move. So
So, but what a profound challenge to renew our society, for all of us
yeah.
to get involved locally, to become better aware, to
Mm.
speak up, and so I think that's a very good challenge, Elizabeth.
It's a great career path for young people because there's so much to do. I mean, it would fill a million new lives with purpose and gravitas.
So well said, Elizabeth Nickson. I'm so grateful that you could join us for this conversation today about many things, including looking at the world in terms of how we renew our rights and freedoms and our responsibility as citizens. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your courage and your wisdom.
It was a great pleasure, David. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.